Our text for today, as it has been for the last two sermons and will continue to be for a few more as we go through more of the disadvantaged or vulnerable members of the community. Exodus 22, 21 through 24, and then 25 through 27. It says, "You must not exploit a foreign resident or oppress him, since you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. You must not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them, they will no doubt cry to me, and I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will burn, and I will kill you with a sword. Then your wives will be widows and your children fatherless. If you lend money to my people, to the poor person among you, you must not be like a moneylender to him. You must not charge him interest. If you ever take your neighbor's cloak as collateral, return it to him before sunset, for it is his only covering. It is the clothing for his body. What will he sleep in? And if he cries out to me, I will listen, because I am compassionate." May Yahweh bless His word to our hearts today. And I pray you'll receive this for the word of Yahweh. This is not the word of man. This is the word of Yahweh. So today we're going to begin to look at the second group of people on this list of disadvantaged or vulnerable members in the community. Our last two lessons focused on the foreign resident. Remember, we talked about the ger, and then last week we talked a little bit about physical Israel in Isaiah 56 with the Nakar or the Allogenes in the Greek. Now we're going to turn, beginning in this sermon and in my next lesson, we're going to turn to focus on the widows and the orphans. There is so much about helping widows and orphans in the Bible. I mean, it's over and over and over. If you have a Bible computer on your phone, punch in widow and orphan, or maybe widow and fatherless, and you'll see that this is a commandment that is repeated in multiple ways and many times in Scripture. If you really want to be a Torah observant person, we talk about we're Torah observant Christians. If you really want to be Torah observant, you need to be helping the orphans and the widows. You need to find a genuine widow or find some children who have lost their father to death and help them out materially and or financially. This is one of the weightier matters of the Torah. In the Torah we have the least of the commandments and the greatest of the commandments. Taking care of widows and orphans is one of the great of the commandments. To stop eating pork is good. To start wearing tassels is good, but those are light matters compared to helping widows and orphans. So sometimes I get in trouble when I say that, but I looked at Isaiah chapter 1 this past week to really confirm in my heart and my spirit that it's a true statement. In Isaiah chapter 1, Yahweh rebukes the nation of Judah. He calls them a sinful nation. He even nicknames them Sodom and Gomorrah, His own people. So hear my words, Sodom. Listen to me, Gomorrah. So he calls them Sodom and Gomorrah kind of like a slight. And he tells them, he says, I hate your new moons and your Sabbaths, and I hate your sacrifices. He says, your hands are covered in blood. Why does he say in 1 and 15, when you lift your hands in prayer, I will refuse to look at you. Even if you offer countless prayers, I will not listen. So he doesn't just hate the new moon, Sabbaths, and feasts and sacrifices they were giving, but he hates their prayers. By the way, he's not talking about false feasts here. He's talking about his feasts. His feasts become meaningless when we try to show up for a ceremonial thing, but we're not living our life the other 6 days of the week abiding by the instructions of Yahweh. We can't live like the devil 6 days a week and then come appear before Yahweh on the seventh day Sabbath and think He's going to accept that. That's why he says he hates it. And in verses 16 through 17, he tells us one of the big things that the nation of Judah was doing, or was omitting, we might say. He says, wash yourselves, cleanse yourselves, remove your evil deeds from my sight, stop doing evil, learn to do what is good, seek justice, correct the oppressor, defend the rights of the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. So he doesn't want hypocritical worship. Yahweh loves festivals when they're kept in His honor. When they're kept with a pure heart, He loves them. He loves animal sacrifices when they're done in His honor from a pure heart. But He hates when we keep those things, but we neglect the righteous Israelite women who had lost their husbands to death. Or we neglect the children of those women who no longer had a father to provide for them. We can't neglect the widows and the orphans and keep the Sabbath. We have to do both of them. Like I said, I sometimes get in trouble for pointing out that it doesn't matter how long one's tassels are, how big one's beard are. I say that as a big bearded man. It doesn't matter how big my beard is or how long my tassels are. It doesn't matter which calendar I keep. If I'm not dying to my flesh every day, loving my neighbor, and using my words to heal. Sometimes people hear me say things like that or write things like that, and they think that I'm saying that wearing tassels or keeping the Sabbath is not important. And that's strange, because anybody that knows me knows that I wear tassels and I keep the Sabbath and I have a beard. Wearing tassels is important, but it's not as important as making sure a widow in your community is taken care of. It's not. As a matter of fact, somebody can go to the kingdom of heaven without wearing tassels. They won't have as high of a rank in the kingdom of heaven. Remember Matthew 5:19, Yeshua says, therefore, whosoever of you breaks, or the Greek word is luo there, it probably better is translated loosens, the least of the commandments shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. So there are small commandments that somebody can break or loosen, and they'll still make it to the kingdom, but they'll be called least. But if you practice and teach even the least of the commandments, you'll be called great. Notice, you cannot break great commandments and make it to the kingdom of heaven. You can't. You can't be an adulterer, a murderer, a thief, a blasphemer, unrepentant, and make it to the kingdom of heaven. You can, though, not wear tassels and make it to the kingdom of heaven. That shouldn't make us say, well, I'm not going to wear my tassels then. We don't want to do the bare minimum. This is not in my notes, but I heard this past week when a subject was brought up, somebody immediately said, was that a heaven or hell issue? Is that a salvation issue? Is that how we should walk before Yahweh, asking that all the time? What if every time my wife asked me to do something around the house, I looked at her and I said, is that a divorce issue? Is that going to make or break our marriage? And she says, well, no, I'm not going to divorce you over it. And I say, well, I'm not going to do it then. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? Well, that's what we sound like when we are talking about a subject like, let's say, the tassels, and somebody asked me and said, well, is it a salvation issue though, Brother Matthew? Why do you say that? It's because you're trying to weasel out of something. Just keep every commandment that applies. But tassels is one of the least of the commandments. When I first put my notes together for the sermon, I had written down that taking care of widows and orphans was more important than even the Sabbath. Now, I think that sometimes it can be. But I had some time to meditate. I was riding by myself a few hours in my truck yesterday. I had to go pick up a trailer out of town. And I had time to meditate on my sermon notes. And sometimes taking care of a widow is more important than the Sabbath. Sometimes taking care of anybody is more important than the Sabbath, because life ranks higher than Shabbat. I used to buy a parking ticket when I would go sit and read the Bible to my brother-in-law on the Sabbath. I wasn't buying that parking ticket to try to despise Yahweh's Sabbath, but I had to buy it to get into the parking deck to go into the hospital, right? So I wasn't doing it of my own volition or my own accord. I was doing it to help my brother-in-law. But I don't think it's wise to say, like I had initially put in my sermon notes, taking care of widows and orphans is more important than the Sabbath. I think it's better to say it's equal importance with the Sabbath. I think that if the nation of Judah in Isaiah 1 had been really meticulous in taking care of the widows and the orphans, but they said phooey on the Sabbath, I think Yahweh would have said, look, you need to start keeping the Sabbath. So I think it's equal of importance. We don't want to do one or the other. We want to do both. We want to even keep the least of the commandments, like wearing the tassels. In the Hebrew culture, the man is always the primary provider, not the woman. That doesn't mean the Hebrew wives were not hard workers. Proverbs 31, part of it says of the capable wife or the virtuous woman, she is a hard worker, strong and industrious. It says she looks at land and buys it, and with money she has earned, she plants a vineyard. But the Hebrew wife's work generally consisted of taking what the husband brought home and making more of it. Men, have you ever thought about how that women always make more of what we give to them? They do. The man would supply or provide the material. The woman would work it into clothes for the family. The man would slaughter the cow, the woman would make the meal. The man would build the house, the woman would make it into a home. I feel like a lost puppy dog when my wife's gone from me for one night. Brother Rocket said he feels the same when Sister Phyllis is gone. We're looking forward to seeing Sister Phyllis. I know he misses her. She's a good woman. Hebrew women were stay-at-home wives and mothers. While the husband was out working to provide, the wife was teaching the children and keeping the home. On a little side note here, us men need to realize that we are the provider. I don't always feel like getting up and going to work. I told my wife the other day, I said, 26 years I've been going outside cranking this truck. Here we are for the 27th. I do it because it's what I'm supposed to do. All husbands and fathers in here need to remember that. You live for Yahweh whether you feel like it or not. And you live for your wife and your family whether you feel like it or not. This is why the Torah speaks of fatherless children. Sometimes Bibles will translate it as orphan, sometimes as fatherless. Fatherless is the best of the two translations. A child whose mother has died can be called an orphan. But if the Hebrew child's father was still alive, they had a strong provider. That being said, the word orphan again can carry the meaning of motherless child too. So if we help out either a fatherless or a motherless child, we are obeying the commandment. Remember how I say often that words are defined by their context? The Hebrew word for a widow is Almana in the Hebrew. If you look at it in context before we get into what I want to talk about now in the verse, but notice it says you must not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. That's HCSB. If you do mistreat them, they will no doubt cry to me, and I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will burn, and I will kill you with the sword. Who is the you? Has to be the men. Because he says, then your wives will be widows, and your children will be fatherless, orphans. See how that word specifically means without a father? Not that a child without a mother can't be an orphan, but specifically it goes back to the father. But look at the seriousness of this here. Look at how serious. He says, if you mistreat a widow and an orphan, he will hear their cry. When they cry out for mercy and help and say, Yahweh, I've been mistreated. My husband has died. My dad is gone. People are in the community are not taking care of me. We're vulnerable. We're disadvantaged and we're not being taken care of. Yahweh sees the sin of the people that are doing the mistreatment, and it says He has this fierce burning anger towards somebody that does this. Imagine Yahweh's face getting hot. You ever been so angry your face got hot or red? I have. Imagine Yahweh's face getting hot as He looks down at somebody and He says they had the opportunity to take care of a widow or a fatherless child and they didn't do it. Or they think they keep my Torah, they're keeping Shabbat, they're eating kosher, but they're not taking care of widows and orphans. My anger is burning. He says He'll kill you with a sword. That can apply throughout all time, but immediately in the context, it probably refers to Yahweh using a foreign nation to come against the men of Israel and killing them with a sword. You don't get any more powerful or serious than that. This past week I went back and listened to one of my own sermons when I was 29 years old, and I listened to one of Brother TJ's sermons from 10 years ago when he was in his early 30s. And Brother TJ mentioned this text in his lesson, and his lesson helped me out in my study notes this week. I appreciate that, Brother TJ. It was on the last verse of the book of James, chapter 1. We'll get to that text here momentarily. There are 54 occurrences of the Hebrew word Almana in the Tanakh. Almana refers to a widow, a woman who has lost her husband to death. It might refer to a woman who has been abandoned by her husband. Sometimes the word Almana refers to a desolate location or a desolate place. I do think that there's room for nuance in the word because sometimes I'll have as a minister women or children that have been abused, mistreated, and they may have had to flee from a tyrant husband. I think that those women can also fall under the category of Almanah because it was out of their hands, out of their circumstance, uncontrollable circumstance, I should say. I'm going to talk more about genuine widows the next time I get to preach. I'm going to walk through 1 Timothy 5, 1 through 16. We're going to exegete each verse where Paul gives his commentary or midrash on the Torah portions about widows and orphans, and we'll learn some from that the next time I teach. I want to go through some of these verses, not all of them, but some of the verses that use this Hebrew word, and we're going to read them. I want to make a few comments. Exodus 22, our initial text, is powerful enough, but when we see some of the parallel texts in the Torah about the widows and the orphans, it helps to solidify how serious this is in our walk with Yahweh. Deuteronomy 14, 28 through 29. At the end of 3 years, bring a tenth, a tithe, of all your produce for that year and store it within your gates. This was a special tithe of the third year. My hermeneutics and exegesis believes this was the third year in the sabbatical cycle. Some people say it's every third year, like 3, 6, 9. Some people say it's 3 and 6 in the sabbatical cycle. I think it's the third year in the sabbatical cycle because the very next chapter, the very next verse speaks of the 7th year in Deuteronomy 15, verse 1. This was a special year of tithing where you wouldn't take your tithe to the place Yahweh put His name, but you would store it within your homes and your gates, and the people in that local community could come at any time to your house and partake of the tithe if they were a Levite, a foreign resident, a widow, or a fatherless child. Verse 29, then the Levite who has no portion or inheritance among you, the foreign resident, fatherless, and the widow within your gates may come and eat and be satisfied, and Yahweh your mighty one will bless you in all the work of your hands that you do. See, the tithes in Israel did not just go to the priest. Some people I've heard say in the Torah community, well, I don't tithe because there's no active Levite priesthood. We could get into that particularly, and we could talk about how that prophets were tithed to or preachers were tithed to, but regardless of that, that's for another message at another time. What about the widows and the orphans? We still have them. Are you tithing to them? Are you tithing to them? I tell people, listen, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. Tithe means 10%, and a good practice is to take 10% of what you make, what you earn, and give. Amen. Give to the ministry, give to the poor, which includes the orphans, the widows, and then save for the feast. Some of your tithe money you can save for yourself to buy things like wine, beer, food for the feast, as long as when you get to the feast you share it with everybody. You have to share it, but you can use some of your tithe money to save for the feast. If you do that, each time a feast rolls around, you'll be ready for the feast. You won't have to scramble and say, where am I going to get the money? You've already got it. I use envelope system. My dad taught me. I still use that today. Or if you meet a widow and you've been putting back, you didn't know a widow for a little while, and all of a sudden you've been putting back, and a widow happens in our community. This is specifically talking about the community of Israel. We can help those outside too that are righteous. We don't just want to give to anybody. We can help those that are righteous. But when they come along, you've been saving up, all of a sudden your charity is there. You have it to give. You don't say, well, I don't have anything to give. I've been using all my money on myself. No, I go to my widow envelope and I get my money out and I bless the widow. We need to be tithing, brothers and sisters. We need to be giving. Deuteronomy 24, 17 through 18. Do not deny justice to a foreign resident, that's the ger, or fatherless child, and do not take a widow's garment as security. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and Yahweh, your mighty one, redeemed you from there. Therefore, I'm commanding you to do this. If a Hebrew made a loan to a person, they would sometimes take something valuable from that person, and you'd keep it in your home as collateral or as a guarantee or security that the loan would be one day paid. See what I'm saying? Like, let's say, I asked Brother Jeff for a loan, and he loaned me a large amount of money, and he said, for security, we're brothers for security. He said, I want to keep something valuable to you to guarantee that you'd pay me back. There's nothing wrong with that. Well, a good Hebrew would never take a widow's clothes for security. Never take it. A good Hebrew would be given to the widow in the first place. Job 22, 9 through 11. In Job 22, Eliphaz speaks of a wicked person by saying this, You sent widows away empty-handed, and the strength of the fatherless was crushed. Therefore snares surround you, and sudden dread terrifies you, or darkness, so you cannot see, and a flood of water covers you. In Job 24, 2 through 3, Job says to himself, the wicked displace boundary markers. They steal a flock and provide pasture for it. They drive away the donkeys owned by the fatherless and take a widow's ox as collateral. In Job 29, Job recalls his glory days prior to going through his time of trial. He says in verses 12 through 13, I rescued the poor man who cried out for help, and the fatherless child who had no one to support him. The dying man blessed me, and I made the widow's heart rejoice. When a widow or a fatherless child saw Job, they smiled because they said, that's a man that'll take care of us. This is part of what made Job a righteous man. Job 1. Psalm 68:5 says that Yahweh is a father of the fatherless and a champion of widows. If we want to be like Yahweh, we too will champion the widows and be a father to the fatherless. We'll be a parent figure to fatherless children. The word champion in the HCSB is dayan in Hebrew. It might be better translated as judge. Some Bibles say judge, some Bibles say defender. I think I like that one the best. He's a defender of the widows. It's as though he's a judge on a seat and he's hearing a widow's case and he doesn't neglect her just because she doesn't have money or she's poor. He defends her case to make sure that she's taken care of. We say we want to be like Yahweh. If we do, we'll be a father to the fatherless and a defender of the widows. Proverbs 15:25, Good News Translation, says, Yahweh will destroy the homes of arrogant men, but He will protect the widow's property. No matter how good a wicked man has it, he will eventually be destroyed. He might go day after day after day thinking everything is fine. One day, Yahweh's judgment will come down. And no matter how bad a widow has it, she will one day eventually be rewarded. Another wisdom book that often gets left out is the Wisdom of Sirro. It has this to say in chapter 4, verse 10, Good News Translation. Be like a father to the orphans and provide widows with the help their husbands can no longer give them. Then you will be like a child of the Most High, and He will love you more than your own mother does. That's powerful. It also says in Sirach 35, 14 through 15, again, Good News Translation, when orphans and widows pour out their prayers, He, speaking of Yahweh, does not ignore them. The tears running down a widow's cheek cry out in accusation against the one who has caused her distress. I saw a widow woman recently and I saw a tear run down her cheek. And it was because of some things that had happened to her. Yahweh sees that tear. He won't let it go unnoticed. Sirach 35. In Mark chapter 12, 38 through 40, Yeshua says this, Beware of the scribes who want to go around in long robes and who want greetings in the marketplaces, the front seats in the synagogues, and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and say long prayers just for show. These will receive harsher punishment. A scribe, I've taught on this before, is basically a man who is highly learned and skilled in the law of Moshe, who can interpret it correctly and teach it wisely, who you can ask a question to and he knows where to go for the answer. That's a scribe. Ezra was a righteous scribe. But in Yeshua's day, there were obviously some unrighteous scribes. They looked the part. They had the long robe. They liked to be called Rabbi, Rabbi. When they entered into the synagogue, they marched up and they sat on the front seat because they said, that's where I deserve to sit. Yeshua says, when you enter in the synagogue, sit in the back seat so that somebody important will say, hey, come sit up in the front. He said, if you sit in the front, somebody might say, this is reserved for the widow. You need to sit back there. These scribes knew the Torah, but these ones neglected the parts that called for the protection of the widows. Somehow these scribes were able to squirm and weasel their way into the possessions of a widow. Can you imagine that? A man being so wicked that instead of giving to the widow, he smooth talks her and has her give to him. Think of the TV preachers. I have done work for little old women that listen to TV preachers. And the TV preacher would say, There's a little old woman out there with a white blouse on. Touch your hand on the screen. How many women you think are wearing a white blouse when that TV preacher is talking? Touch your hand on the screen. If you sow a seed of $1,000 to this ministry, you'll be blessed with a $1,000 fold. And the little old widow woman, she gives her money away to the diabolical, devilish, wicked son of Satan TV preacher that's stealing from these women. Well, that's what was happening here with these scribes. The long prayers, notice it says they devour widows' houses and say long prayers just for show. It's possible that what they did was they said, if you give me a certain amount of money, I'll pray a long prayer for you and bless you. That's probably what was going on here. And so then they bowed their head and they prayed this long, eloquent prayer. And the widow thought, this is going to be great. But yet that prayer was bouncing off the wall, because Yahweh doesn't hear the prayer of the unrighteous man. He hears the prayer of the penitent man. So he prayed on her actual righteousness to fund his fake righteousness. Notice at the end it says these will receive harsher punishment. There in verse 40. All sin is sin, but some sins are greater than others. So on the last day when sin is ultimately punished, anyone who took advantage of a widow or a fatherless child will be more punished than one who did not. Anybody ever notice that poor people are often charitable? Oftentimes they're more charitable than wealthy people. I saw a video the other day where there was a guy on the street and he was dressed poorly, and he was walking up to people on the street asking for some money for food or for some food. And most people that were dressed nice, they didn't even look at him. Some of them kind of walked, stepped out of the way, kind of like that Levite did when that guy had been beat up on the side of the road. But then this guy on the video, he walked up to this poor person, had tattoos all over his body. And he said, hey man, could I have some change for the bus? And the poor man said, I don't have much, but I'll give you everything I got. And then the guy said, keep your change, and he blessed him with $500. Oftentimes poor people know how blessed it is just to have a little bit, so they don't mind giving it away. Proverbs 15:17 says, better a meal of vegetables where there is love than a fattened calf with hatred. It's better if a big family gets together and just eats vegetable soup than a bigger family getting together that has hatred in between it. And they got the nice meat, the steak. Right after Yeshua warns the people of these wicked scribes, he goes on in the very next verses and he points out a poor widow's heart that gave in Mark 12:41 through 44. Yeshua was watching people drop money into the temple treasury. I have a book at my house called something about the temple. I can't remember the title of it, but it's by a man named Alfred Edersheim. Mr. Edersheim grew up in a Jewish home, and he later converted to Christianity or Messianic Judaism. And in his book, he mentions that there at the temple, they would have these canisters where people would give money or coins to the temple. And he said that sometimes they were shaped like a trumpet, and that this is probably what Yeshua meant when it says when you give, don't sound a trumpet. He didn't mean they were necessarily blowing a trumpet, but they would make sure that their coins clanged into the trumpet-shaped canister. Well, Yeshua was watching all these men drop a lot of coins into the canister, and then all of a sudden, this little poor widow, she walked up and she dropped in 2 tiny coins, worth very little, the text said. And he looked at his disciples, his students, and he said, that widow gave more than everybody else because they gave out of their surplus, but she gave all that she had to live on. It's amazing what hard times will do to humble you. It's not so much about the amount you give, it's more about how much you have left over. If Yahweh has blessed you, bless somebody else. The book of James, or Yaakov 1:27, New Living Translation, says this: pure and undefiled religion before Yahweh the Father is this, to care for orphans and widows in their adversity, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. You know, sometimes I wonder, there's ways you can understand this, but sometimes I wonder if how we actually keep ourselves unstained is to use our wealth to help those in need. Do you know the Bible teaches, both the accepted Protestant canon and also the Deuterocanon or the Apocrypha teaches that almsgiving atones or covers over sin. I don't say that to teach that it does what Yeshua did. But when I taught a message on that, my studies showed that the more we give, the less sin resides in our heart and in our mind when we give away our wealth. A giving heart is a pure heart. A helping hand is a good hand. I've heard a lot of people say when I talk to them about this or talk about this message on widows and orphans, they say, I don't know any orphans or widows. But then when I talk to the person more, they haven't really spent much time looking for one. Seek and you shall find. Not trying to misuse that verse, but it's a general principle. If you don't know a widow, look for one. If you don't know a fatherless child, look for one. Find one. Find somebody who's disadvantaged. And then when you find them, give, and give plentifully. We need to put money back each week. Every time we get money, we need to put some of it back to help out the widows and the orphans, specifically. And also the poor, people that have fallen on hard times. We'll talk about them eventually. They're in this section of Scripture too. But right now we're on the widows and the orphans. There's a great reward for those who do this. Not just in the kingdom of heaven. There is a reward in the kingdom of heaven for giving away your money on the earth. But there's also rewards here on this earth now. It is so much more blessed to give than it is to receive. If you've ever given to somebody who it really touched, you'll find out what that means. Because when you give to a poor person that doesn't have much or a widow, the tears on their face and the gratefulness in their heart and in their voice, man, it's such a blessing. And you'll be blessed. You'll be blessed when you do that. I don't give because I'm looking for a blessing necessarily, but it always happens whether I'm looking for it or not. It's amazing. Sometimes I will give and I'll be given back to equally or double the next day. It's strange how that happens. But it happens. We can't take our money with us when we die. So why not give some of it away to help a person in need? You don't have to give all of it away. Yahweh's not telling you to necessarily give it all away. Some people are called to that much of a sacrificial life. Some people are. And they just live as a monk or somebody alone, whether man or woman. But Yahweh's just asking you to give a portion of it away. You can't help everybody, but you can help somebody. Amen? I pray that this sermon stirs your heart to find a widow or widows and orphans and give. I pray that it does. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall think on it day and night. Be careful to do what Yah tells you to do, so that you will have good success. Don't turn to the right, don't turn to the left, but stay on the narrow path. Be careful to do what Yah tells you to do, so that you will have good success.